Good afternoon, guys. My name is Carlos. I'm a web developer based in Brooklyn, New York. And today we're going to work on a project called Ravenous Part 1. There's a project that will be split into 4 different smaller projects. And this is part of the Build Front-End Web Applications from Scratch course. Now, in order to complete this project, at this point you should be familiar with how to work with JavaScript fundamentals. You should know how to work with arrays, how to create loops and functions, how are objects structured. You should know how to use your dev tools. I'm going to use Google Chrome for this project to actually render our application. So you should know how to actually debug a lot, where to console log, how to use your debugger a little bit. You should know how to work with HTML and CSS files, how to create certain HTML selectors, how to pass them around, how to pass in classes. You should know how to write CSS. We're not gonna be writing CSS, but we're gonna be viewing a lot of CSS files. So you should be able to know how to read them. And you should also be familiar with working in your terminal and creating directories, moving files around, importing them, and how they stand in the structure of your project. So we're going to be building this project in your local machine. So you should also have your text editor set up. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code, and you should have your terminal set up along with Node and certain packages that were globally installed. If you're jumping ahead, just make sure you've already installed certain of the requirements for this project before you actually get started, because you need your own text editor, you need your own terminal, and I believe React app is a package that should already be installed in your local machine. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and just get started. Okay, welcome to the Ravenous project. So this will be the first installment of the project, and over the next few weeks, as you go through this project, you're going to be building this website called Ravenous, which essentially works like Yelp. So there's going to be 4 parts to this project. The first one we're going to be doing is creating static components and just setting up our whole project structure. The second part will be passing information to the components. Then we're going to start by setting the state of the Ravenous components. So each component has its own state. And then we're going to interact with the Yelp API. We're going to make certain queries to the Yelp API and grab information from there. So today we're going to create the static components. And what we're going to be doing, we have 3 goals listed right here for us. And this is basically some user questions to ask yourself when you're designing an application. So these are, for us right now, for Ravenous, would be, as a user, I should be able to search for restaurants. As a user, I should be able to view a list of restaurants returned by the Yelp API. And as a user, I should be able to sort through restaurants using a filter. So throughout all the projects we'll be doing, which will be basically building this larger scale application, we're going to be implementing each of these goals. And this will be testing a lot of your JavaScript and React knowledge. So expect to spend at least a day for each of these projects. If it takes you longer, don't worry about it. That's fine. It's expected. If you find yourself struggling a lot, try to even look back into the old Code Academy exercises for relevant information that might assist you. If you're still struggling through that, we'll provide you with some guidance as needed. But give it your best shot. Also, feel free to Google for questions. Don't panic too much if you're struggling. It's expected, and it's a good sign if you're struggling, because this is how you're going to learn. And every time you go through a new step of the project, so for this step on the browser here on the Code Academy site, you'll be displayed the actual end product. So by the end of this project, we should have something that looks kind of like this. The logic hasn't been integrated, so the Let's Go button is not actually working. All we're doing is simply displaying certain components here. We have what looks like a search section here, like a header. And then we have what's below it, a list of restaurants that are just being displayed and laid out for you. So even before you start out, kind of think about how you design the components here. With React, you're going to be using a lot of reusable components here. So kind of try to like wrap your head around how the containers will be structured, what will they be containing, and how you're going to place them around. So right off the bat, you can already see kind of like maybe 3 components here. You have this big search header one. Maybe within this search header, there's another component that could be this, which are the filters we're going to be using. And below that, we have what looks like a list of restaurants. Remember, this kind of like works like a Yelp, like the Yelp website. So we're going to search for a type of business and give a location, and that should render us a bunch of restaurants. So you can think of maybe this whole list being a component itself, and then maybe each restaurant here is a component as well. So you can see how this one component can be fed into a larger component that's like wrapped around it. So try to think about how you design this, and it'll be just be easier to actually figure out how you're going to structure your project. But let's go ahead and just jump into creating our project structure and then setting up our components. So let's go into step 1 here. Okay, so we're going to start by creating our React app, and we're going to do that by calling create React app in our preferred terminal. So I'm going to get off the full screen here, and I'm going to bring iTerm, which is the terminal I'm using, and I'm already in a folder called Codecademy, so I'm going to create React app here. So let's go ahead and create React app. We're going to call it Ravenous. In case you don't know if you have create React app, you can simply type in -- version to see if you have it. If you don't get any output, then you probably need to install that globally. So let's go ahead and call this Ravenous, and that will create a React app. Now, create a React app is very useful because setting up and configuring a React application from scratch has a lot of steps. Like we need a compiler to translate our JSX and ESX syntax into ES5 so that it can be read by browsers. We need to set up our configuration for the package JSON and our dependencies. So create React app usefully does everything for us right off the bat, so we can simply just dig into the application and start modifying as we wish. Okay, so as soon as we have that, I'm going to move on to step 2, where we're going to start the actual server. And I'm going to pause for a second, so I'm going to change this so we can actually look at an editor and at the instructions at the same time. So, okay, you don't have to do this. I just did it, so it'll make sense in a second. So once you're in your terminal, change into the Ravenous project, and let's open up our text editor. So I'm going to be using my text editor here right next to the instructions here. And I'm also going to start using the built-in terminal, okay? So I'm going to open up my terminal in VS Code. You can still use your preferred terminal. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit more so we can see what we're writing here. Okay, so in step 2, we're simply going to change into a directory from our terminal. And then we're going to hit npm start to start our server application. Now this might take a second, depending how fast your internet connection is. Mine is a bit slow today for some reason. Okay, and you'll see the sample application that was built for us with Create React App. You'll see all of this was created for us. We have our app component here. If we look at our index HTML, we see the actual text that was passed into it here. Our index is basically where we're going to be rendering our DOM. You can see that the app component is being rendered on top of an element in our index HTML page with the ID of root, which is, let me see right here, which is this div right here. So this icon is provided for us by Create React App, and this is all just already configured for us. So we're going to be changing a lot of this stuff, so don't worry too much about what's inside the app at this moment. Okay, let's move on to step 3. In step 3, we're going to replace the current favicon located in public favicon.ico, and we're going to replace it with that little logo here. So I'm going to open it up in the new window. Just right-click and save image as, and save it directly into the folder where the favicon is. So I have that in right over here, public. So I'm going to just call it favicon.ico as well, and just replace the one I have there. Excuse the ads here, guys. Okay, we're good here. Okay, let's move on to step 4. So if you look at your folder structure here, you'll see that we just replaced the favicon here. Okay, now we need to actually reset the CSS. So we need to reset the CSS so that our CSS can be read the same way in the same style in every browser. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to open up a new terminal. Actually, I'm just going to kill this terminal. Clear that space. We're going to make our CSS file inside our public folder here. So let's navigate there. So I'm going to type ls to see where I'm at. I'm going to change into my public directory. And we're going to create a file with touch, and it's going to be called reset.css. So you'll see I have our CSS right here. and they want us to copy and paste the CSS that is provided in that step here. So let's load it up here. I'll grab that, and then I'll copy paste it here, and then we'll save that. So at the moment that doesn't really do anything because we haven't really imported the CSS anywhere. I think it's that a little better, guys. Okay. So let's move on to step 5. So now we actually got to link our CSS in the index.html file, so that's also located in the public directory. So let's go into our index file, and if you worked with HTML before, you should already know how to actually link a CSS file. I'm using HTML tags in my editor, so I can simply just have a snippet here that creates a CSS rel sheet, style sheet to link it to. And we're going to pass in the href, the reference to this file, which is in the same folder. So we're going to use the same folder, and we're going to click Reset CSS. I'm also going to specify that this is text CSS. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. And just keep this file open. Okay, now we're going to use Google Fonts for step 6. We're going to grab these rel sheets, this link sheets that we have here from Google Fonts, and we're simply going to add them into our HTML file. I'm going to add them right below our CSS file, right over here. Now that there's a bunch of fonts from Google, Google Fonts, if you go to fonts.google.com, that's a library with about 900 licensed fonts that you can use, and you can simply take a look at examples on their website, and you can link them just like this. So if you want to style your sheet, your page with a little nicer font, you can go ahead and navigate and simply add the style sheets like this. Okay, let's go on and start creating our first component here. For step 7, we're going to create our business.js component. So we know that our Ravenous page will be composed of 4 different components. We have the main business component, the business list, we have our search bar, and we have our app component. So we can take a look right over here. We have our main app component, which is basically the whole container for this. And then we have our search component here, search bar component, which will be where we're going to pass in search input, and then we're going to pass in some sort of filter here. Then we have our business list, which is basically this list of containers that each one that is basically a business component itself. So we have a business component, business list component, and inside the business list component, we're rendering other business components, individual business components. Okay, let's go back here. So since we're going to be creating 4 components in this project, we're going to end up structuring this application that was made for us a little bit differently. So inside our source folder here, we're going to start by creating a components folder. And that's where we're going to store all of our components. Okay, so let's navigate outside of the public folder. If you were there, let's go into source, and then we're going to make a folder called components here. Once we're in there, we can change into the components folder. We'll do that in the following step. So let's move on to step 8. Let's unclick this one. So each component will have its own folder inside components. So that's in order for us to actually create a JavaScript file and a CSS file, so they kind of like have a relation there. So we're going to create a business folder inside our components folder, and inside that directory, we're going to create these 2 files. So let's go ahead and change into components, and then here we're going to create our directory called business. So this will hold anything related to the business component. So we'll create a business.js file, and we'll also create a business.css file. Okay, looking good here. So you can see we have our components folder inside our source folder, and inside our components we have our business component. And I didn't change into my business folder, so I'm just going to drag them into here. Okay, so now our business folder has information of the components we're going to be creating. And let's go ahead and save our index file as well. Okay, let's move on to step number 9. Okay, now we can begin by creating our first React component. So once again, we're looking at this individual component. This would be the business component. So you can see there's information being displayed about the restaurant itself, or the business itself. It doesn't have to be a restaurant. We have the title, we have the address, city, the zip code, what kind of food it is, the ratings, and the reviews. So in order to do that, we're going to simply hard code for now certain information on this. So inside our business.js file, we're going to start by creating an object called business. And we're going to set it equal to the provided information here. Okay, so we have our image source, the name, the address, the city, the zip code. And that's basically what's the information that's going to be rendered on the component once we actually display it on our DOM. Eventually, we're going to start using the Yelp API and actually start updating this dynamically. So we're not going to be hard coding a pretend restaurant. We're going to grab information from the Yelp API, and this will be replaced by that information. Okay, let's move on to step 10. Okay. In order to start writing JSX and writing React in general, we're going to have to actually import the library inside our file here. So in order to import it, we're simply going to do it at the top of our line by typing import React. And that simply imports the library from the React package here. So go ahead and save that. And now we can actually start writing JSX and writing React kind of language that will be able to be compiled into ES5. Okay, for step 11, below our business object, we're going to start by creating a React component called business. So we can actually define components as classes or functions. Usually, if there's no state in our component, then we write them out as functional components. But we can write them out as classes as well if they have state or don't. And at the moment, there's more features for components that are defined as classes. But in order to actually just do that, we're going to use a class in our case. In order to define a component as a class, we actually need to extend it from the component class that's found in React. So let's type in the name of our component with a capital letter here. So that's just convention. Usually you write a class with a capital letter. And we're going to extend the React component class. So you can type in, sorry, my snippets are activated for most of these guys. Let's start it out by empty. So you can type it as React component. You could also import the component class here directly from the React library and type it in as by calling it directly from there. So now we're actually importing the component property from the React library. But we're going to stick to the other way around just so that it's easier to import everything once you start. Once again, you can write it differently if you like, but that's another option. Okay, so this should simply be blank for now, and in step 12, we're going to start actually running certain stuff. Okay, for step 12, we're going to add a render method to the business component. So render method, so the render method is actually required in our class component. And this render method is typically used to return the following types. There's like React elements, so you can return array and fragments, strings and numbers, booleans. In this case, for our components, a majority of components, what a render method will do is render a lot of JSX. So let's start out by simply typing in render, and we're going to make our function empty for now. So also keep in mind that the render function, it should be pure. And what I mean by this is that it should not modify any component state. It always returns the same result each time it's invoked, and it doesn't directly interact with the browser. Okay? So we're not going to be changing any state with this method. We're simply going to be rendering JSX the same way every time it's called. So this makes it easier to think about how your component is structured since it will always be returning the same information. Okay, let's start adding stuff to our render method here. So inside our render method, we're going to return some JSX that they have provided for us. I'm going to close these other windows here. And let's just grab that. Copy paste this into your render method. So we need to return. I'm going to add a parentheses here so we have a new line to actually write our HTML and our JSX. You can simply add it right next to the return. The reason I put in the parentheses is that if I didn't put it in, if I put it in the new line, it would just stop the function here. So I do it just to be like, hey, there's still some actual information to return. So I'm going to pass in our divs here. You might see a little error here. There's a curly bracket that's not supposed to be there at the moment. And we're actually going to be changing this in JSX. So JSX is, it's not exactly HTML and it's not exactly JavaScript. So you can kind of intertwine both of them and use them at the same time. So inside our HTML, we can actually render certain variables or do if statements or function expressions if we'd like in here. Now, there's one thing, once we actually compile this, what our compiler will do, a lot of times we use Babel here, is it will translate all this JSX into code that can be read in browsers. So all this JSX will be translated into JavaScript that is rendering JSX information into the DOM. So if we actually were to render certain JSX on the browser, it would get confused because it's trying to combine JavaScript and HTML, and it can't do that. So in the syntax here, in order to put in JavaScript expressions, we just need to wrap them in curly braces. Also, certain class names here and attributes have to be changed into specific JSX languages here. So we got to change the class attributes to class name. So I'm going to grab all these classes here, and I'm going to just type them out as class name. So it will still change that class name into class. Just class is a keyword in JavaScript. And remember, we're not really running JavaScript or HTML. We're running JSX, which is just an extension of JavaScript. So we got to change that. And then instead of hard coding the actual strings here in the tags of like a paragraph and the city, we're gonna change that into the values from the objects keys here. So Marginato Pizzeria would actually be object, which would be the key property of our business object. So how do we do that? Well, since we can wrap JavaScript expressions in curly brackets, we can simply call business.name. And that will render the JSX value of the property of name from the business object. So we can do the same for our address here. We have Paddington Way. So we're going to render business.address. This will be the city. So business.city. I know it said it differently. Flavor town, border town, it's the same. For the state, we're going to simply render it. So this makes it more dynamic. Do you see? Business.state. And remember this zip code here, I'm going to write it in a separate curly bracket so we can actually type in, and save the space in here. So business.zip-code. Let's change this Italian into business.category. And our rating here, since we're just going to pass in the number, business.rating. And reviews will also just pass in the number, business.review count. Okay, let's go ahead and save that, and we'll move on to step 14. So remember, this will eventually be more dynamic. We're not going to be actually hard coding any businesses here. We're going to be grabbing information from the Yelp API, and this will be rendering certain properties from that business that we grab from the Yelp API. So you can see how this is dynamic in the sense that it will just provide always the same information. And you can see it in our business cards. There we go. You can see it on our business cards that here's the information. We got our picture, which is basically a div container called image container, and that holds our image source, our business name, our business address, city, and state. And the reason it's repeated here is because we're simply hard coding. So by the end of this project, we're going to get something that looks like this. Okay, let's move on to step 14. So we have all our HTML kind of JavaScript JSX syntax here, and we have classes names attached to each container and selectors, but they're not really styled and they have class names. So in order to style them, we have to fill out our business CSS file. So fortunately, we are provided with some CSS that we can grab. I'll close this guy. Oh, there we go. Let me grab our CSS here, paste it over here. Okay, perfect. So now we have some CSS in our business file. Let's move on to step 15. Okay, so our CSS is not useful if we actually don't import the CSS into our business.js file. So we just have to import it directly from the relation of it from the business.js file. So we can simply just import the file directly called business CSS. And remember, if you're having issues here, just make sure that you have the files in the same folder. If they're found in different folders, this won't be working because it won't be finding the CSS file in a different folder. Okay, let's move on to step 16. We have successfully built our first component, and this is the business component. Now we're actually gonna, so we're essentially just built this component. It's not being rendered at the moment because we're not having, it's not being contained or rendered in the app component, but we're essentially, when we're rendering them, we're gonna be creating this kind of little card here looking. And you can see the CSS if you'd like. There's certain information about how it's displayed, what the image container will be like, the height, and the headers, and the business information. But yeah, this is a business component that we'll be rendering. We're going to add other components and actually have a business list that will be rendering each of these singular business components. But in order to actually use it in different components or the app component, we actually have to export it. So we can simply type in export default business. Let's add here. And now we can actually import it in different files and start using this component itself. So make sure you save your file, and then we'll move on to the next step. Here, let me uncheck the 18 here. Okay, so now we're going to create the business list component, and this will be the container that will render each individual business component. So same as we did last time, navigate to your components folder, and let's create a business list component. Then we'll change into that directory, and then we're going to touch two business list files. One will be a JavaScript file, so businesslist.js, and the other one will be a businesslist.css. And you can see that our files were created and our project structure here. I'm going to close these files and open up our business list files, so our CSS and our JavaScript file. Okay, so we're good. Let's move on to step 18. For our business list CSS file, we're going to add the following styling for a business list component. So let's grab and copy paste what is provided for us on step 18. Okay, let's move on to step 19. Now we're ready to start building our component. So we're going to open up our business list.js file, and we're going to import both the React library and the CSS that we just created. So just like we did for the other component, import React from React and import the business CSS file. Remember, it's relative since it's in the same folder. Let's move on to step 20. So the point of the business list component is to simulate what a return list of businesses will look like in Ravenous. To help the simulation, business list will make use of the business component repeatedly. To use the business component, you'll have to import it. So let's look back in our file here, in our project. You'll see that we have each business component being rendered, and this whole section here, holding it, that will be the business list component. Okay, so the point of the business list component is to simulate what a return list of business will look like. So we have to actually import the business component inside our business list in order to actually render it. So let's go ahead and import business from, we have to navigate one level up because we're inside our business list folder. We have to navigate up into business folder, and then our business file can be retrieved. Okay, looking good. Let's save that and move on to step 21. So let's start building the component. We're going to use our React library to create a component called business list. So let's go ahead and type in our class name, which will be business list, extends react.component, and make sure you add the curly brackets here and go ahead and save that. Okay, let's move on. For step 22, all we're going to do is simply type in a render method. Make sure you add your curly brackets there. Okay, looking good. So inside our render method, we're going to render some JSX. So I'm going to grab ahead the links here from JSX. You can see we're going to be rendering components with this component here. So let me clear up the indentation. And we're going to go ahead and change the name for class to class name. And we're going to grab all these component containers and change them to rendering of our business component. Make sure you add the closing tag. Go ahead and save that. Also, make sure you're returning what you're rendering here, or else you will get an error. So I'm going to grab my return function here and then pass it in. Perfect. Okay, that's it for step 23. Let's move on to step 24. Now we're actually going to export the component because we're going to be using this component itself and another component. So in order to export it, we can simply type export default business list. Make sure you add your semicolon there, and that's it for step 24. Okay, let's move on to creating our search bar component. So I'm going to go ahead and clear my terminal here, and I'm going to go and navigate. I'm going to go up one level into my components folder. Here I'm going to create a search bar directory, and inside that search bar, I have to navigate into it. I'm going to create two files, searchbar.js, and I'm going to create searchbar.css as well. Okay, that's it for step 25. Let's move on to step 26. So let's go ahead and open up our files here. Let me see where search bar is and our source folder. I'm going to open up CSS and the search bar. Let me move this over here. Okay, let's go to the search bar. We're going to grab the CSS that's provided for us, which is in this file here. Grab all of it and then copy paste it in your search bar CSS file. Make sure you save as well. And now look at your CSS here. You'll see that there's some background images that are in the same directory. And there's one for a mobile, so there's a media query here. So if we're using a mobile, we're going to change the background image, which is the background image right over here at the top. This background image here will change if we're using mobile. So we need to actually save those two images. So I'm going to go ahead and open them up. And we're going to save them in the same directory. Notice how it's being accessed here. It's in the same relative path. So go ahead and save it in the same directory. So we have to go up to Ravenous, source, components, search bar, and we're going to save them right here. And do the same for the other image. We'll do it in the search bar. There we go. I'll get rid of these guys. Okay, let's move on to step 27 now. Okay, so now we're ready to actually start building the component. So let's open up searchbar.js, and at the top of our file, let's import React from the React package here, and we'll also import our CSS file here. Okay, looking good. Okay, so for step 28, we're actually going to be communicating with the Yelp API. So let's look back into how our application is going to be working. We have our search bar here. We're going to be inputting some information about businesses and then a location. And then when we hit this button, eventually we want to hit the Yelp API and retrieve some information about all the restaurants and businesses they provide. We're also going to be able to sort all these results by three certain parameters here. We have best batch, highest rated, and most reviewed. So we're not going to be making the calls today. Today we're simply just going to structure our application to know how it's going to communicate with the Yelp API. And it's important to actually be able to know how the naming conventions are set by the API because we have to actually match them. So if we don't match them, it won't find them and it's going to give us a bunch of errors. So here's some documentation on Yelp's API, and you'll see the parameters that we pass in with our query string when you hit their API. So you can get a locale, the limit, the radius, longitude, and the one we're looking for is the sort by parameter here. So let's go up back into our project here, and we're simply going to create an object called sort by options just to start out. So I'll call it sort by options, and we're just going to set it to an empty object for now. So let's move on to step 29. So inside sort by options, we need actually three keys. And we're going to leave them blank without their values for now. We're going to fill them out later. But we want to sort by best match. We also want to sort by highest rated. And lastly, we want to sort by most reviewed. Okay, go ahead and save that. Don't worry about the syntax error because we're going to correct that in a second here. Okay, so now we can actually look at the documentation and figure out what values we're going to be passing in through here. So let's go back into our sort by option and see what it says. There's an optional parameter, and it's basically a suggestion to the search algorithm that the results be sorted by one of these modes. And here are the modes we're actually interested in. So we're interested in best match, so we have to match the same naming convention that the Yelp API provides. If you don't match the same naming convention and format, then we're getting an error because it won't understand what we're actually asking for. So let's go ahead and set them as values for our properties, and we'll do it for highest rated. Highest rated would be review count. I'm sorry, I did them the other way around. So this should be review count. Highest rated should just be rating. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. Perfect. Let's move on to step 31. So let's start building our search bar component. So we're gonna add, we're gonna do the same we did for the previous components. Let's start by creating our class called search bar. Make sure you extend the React component. And don't add the render method just yet. Let's make sure it extends React component. Don't add the render method just yet. We'll do that afterwards. Okay, let's move on to step 32. We're gonna create a method called render sort by options. Okay. Let's just add the function here inside our class structure, the body of our class, and we're going to fill it out in the next few steps. So let's go on to step 33. So think about the name of this function, render sort by options. We're simply going to be rendering these kind of options in our page. The purpose of this function is that when it's called, it's going to render this list here, basically these options right here. So the purpose of render sort by options is to dynamically create the list items needed to display the sort options. So this is to help future-proof against potential changes to the Yelp API. So if the Yelp API changes eventually and doesn't provide highest rated option, for example, or it provides something different, or maybe you want a lowest rated, you can actually just change it in the sort by options, but this is right now hard coding it. This will eventually be easier to be more dynamic because we're simply just going to be fetching information from the Yelp API. So this method should iterate over all the keys in the sort by options, and it should return us to basically a list item that has a key as an attribute, and the values, which are basically these values here will be like the attribute for the actual list item, and what's going to be rendered and displayed on the DOM will be the actual key property. So let's start out by simply typing in return with no parentheses, and we'll move on to step 34. Okay, for step 34, in order to iterate over the keys here, we can simply call .keys on the JavaScript object library. And what we're going to pass in as an argument will be the object we're actually referring to. So we can simply type object.keys, and then pass in here the sort by options object. So that will return to us an array of all the keys. So best match, highest rated, and most reviewed. Okay, let's move on to step 35. So now that we have access to the keys, we can iterate through them using map. So map basically returns a new array that's been changed or transformed in place. So we can chain it after calling .keys on our object, and we're going to be passing in a function in here in a second. Okay, for step 36, make sure you're using arrow functions. We're going to pass in a callback function inside our map method. Map is a higher order function, meaning it takes a callback function as an argument here. So our argument for this callback function will be called sort by option. So sort by option. And what is sort by option referring to? That is referring to each element inside our array that we're chaining it to. So remember, this returns an array containing the key properties, and then .map returns a callback function, provides a callback function where the argument itself is referring to each element in the array. So now we have sort by option will be best match, and then it will be highest rated, and then most reviewed. And then we're going to execute some sort of function here. Okay, let's look at step 37. You can actually see how it should look like. We're passing sort by option so that we can actually know what element we're referring to. So we're going to be working with that element in the next step. Okay, let's move on to step 38. So now we can actually store the object values in a variable. So inside our callback function, we're going to access the sort by options values using the sort by option parameter of the callback function. So we can store it in a variable called sort by option value. So let's call sort by option value. We're going to set it equal to, how do we get the value of a key property? Well, we have our key property here, and we can refer it from the object using brackets. So sort by options will be the object, and in brackets we pass in the key property to get the value. So we remember we have access to each property through the map method. So we can just sort by option right over here, and then each value will be assigned to sort by option value. Now I'm using yet because we're going to be this will be changing depending on what key property we're accessing. If we're using const, that means the const cannot be changed. It's a constant, so we're not. It wouldn't work with const. So make sure you're using let as your variable here. Okay, let's move on to step 39. Now in step 39, we're going to return the list element. Now the list element should have an attribute called key, which is going to be set to the sort by option value, and the content of the list item should be the sort by option. So remember, the sort by option will be basically this string here. So make sure you actually type in return when you're inside a map callback function, and we're going to return our list item here. So we're going to add the key, and make sure you're using your curly brackets when you use JavaScript expressions. We're going to use sort by option value, and our content will actually be our sort by option. So look again at this function and kind of look back into the actual project. So remember, the sort by option is supposed to render this list here we have at the top, okay? Now we use key because React tends to actually change state a lot, and we need to keep track of certain elements and list items in the DOM or certain other elements when they change. So in order to do that, you have to pass a key attribute that's specific for React, and you have to pass it a unique value. So sort by options value is a unique value to each key property here. So it won't be the same. There's no repeated values here. Okay, that's looking good. Let's move on to step 40. So step 40, that's it for our render sort by options, and we're going to be using that when we start building the rest of our search bar component, which will be rendering each list item for us. So let's go on to step 41, and let's start building the structure of our search bar component. So after our render sort by option, we're going to add the required method for all React components, which is a render method. So let's start a render method here, and inside our render method, we'll do the following. So in step 42, we're going to add a return statement, and we're going to return JSX that they have provided for us here. I'm going to close this out. Grab the JSX and make sure you do a return. Make sure you add your parentheses in your return statement, and let me fix the indentation here for my unordered list. And we're going to do the same thing we've been doing for the rest of the components. Grab all your class attributes and change them to class name. And we're going to call our render sort by options in here inside our unordered list. Now, when we call our sort by options, we can't just call it like this. We actually need to refer to the class itself, because the class search bar, which is a component itself, that has a function render sort by options. So we need to refer to it from the class name. So we use our curly brackets, and we'll call this dot render sort by options. Sort by options. Here we go. It's not working here. There we go. And make sure you call it as well. Don't pass a function definition. You want to call it so that when this is rendered, it's actually being called immediately, and it's rendering as soon as a DOM is being rendered. Okay, and another way, if you actually want to, if you're dealing with this in other situations, a quick way to know what this is referring to is look at when it's invoked. When the function it's invoked, look at the dot next to it, and whatever that is will be what this is referring to. So in this case, we're just calling it here from here. But if we're in some other component or another class, and we type in class name or the whatever we're calling it from, and then the function itself, this will be what is on the left of the dot. Okay, let's move on to step 43. So that's it for a search bar component. The list component will be rendered again by another component, so you actually need to export it. So we need to export default our search bar component. since we're actually going to be passing it into the top level component, which would be technically the app component here. So we'll do that in the next step. Let's go on to step 44. And now we're actually going to put all of these components together and structure them in a way that can be rendered on our DOM. So let's go into our app.js file. And this is the component that was created for us when we used create React app. Now there's a lot of stuff we actually don't need, but we'll be removing it as we go through the last few steps here. So just make sure you're importing React properly if it's not being imported, and make sure that your app CSS file is being imported. I believe create React app does import it anyway, just double check that it's there. And we're actually going to change the CSS for our app CSS file. So go ahead and grab it from the step provided here and open up your app CSS file, which is right here. Replace it, and let's go back to our app.js file. Okay, it's looking good. So now our app component is going to be taking charge of rendering all the other components. We're kind of feeding the rest of the components into the app. So in order to do that, we actually have to import business list and search bar components too. So go to the top of your file. I'm going to import search bar, and we have to navigate to the component. So we're in the source folder already, so we can simply go in the same folder. We can actually go into the components folder. We can navigate to search bar, and we can go into search bar. We're going to do the same for business list, so let's go ahead and import business list from components, business list, and business list once again. Okay, looking good. And yeah, let me clear this out as well. Okay, go ahead and save your file. Now that we're actually importing them, we can actually start using them. So step 46, it tells us that create React app command actually creates default app component, which I already mentioned, and it includes a lot of stuff for rendering inside a return method here. So let's actually I'm going to have you delete everything inside return, because we're not going to be using any of the default information that was given to us from create React app. So delete everything inside of the return statement, and after you do that, let's move on to step 47. Okay, inside step 47, we're going to render specific JSX that is provided for us here. And this will just render basically the components that we imported at the top of our file here. So I'm going to fix my indentation. And once again, we'll change class to class name. And instead of having these comments here, we're going to implement the rendering of our search bar component. Make sure you add the closing tag as well. And our business list component. Seems I have oh, this seems to be an error. I don't know why that imported business list. Okay, so we changed the class name. We rendered the actual components, and we're actually very close to finishing this small scale application here. So let's move on to step 48. Now, create React app, the package evolves and is updated quite a bit. So you'll often see how back in the day you actually didn't even use classes. The way they rendered components was very tedious and quite different than it is from now. So create React app, fortunately, now it's creating classes components for us like this. But if you're actually using this and looking at this from a different version, you might actually have a component that is created like this: export default class app extends component. Now, for the sake of consistency and how we've been actually declaring our classes in the previous components, I'm going to retype this so we can actually have the same way we're actually rendering the components, the other components. So remove the component import from the top of your file if it's there, and replace your extends React component, your component to react.component, and make sure at the bottom of your file you're actually exporting the default app. Okay, go ahead and save this. I'm gonna remove some of these files, and we're almost ready to actually start our server and see how our application looks like. Okay, so go to your terminal, clear it out if you like, and then simply start npm start, and this will start our server here. Also, just double check that your files are being saved, just in case if your CSS is looking funky, then it might be that your CSS wasn't imported properly. Now, you might get some warnings here. For example, we have warnings are not, there's nothing really bad with warnings. It's just basically a warning that's like something could result in an error, potential error in the future. So we see one here for our app.js and line 2 that the logo is not used. Since we're not using it, we can just simply remove that. That's okay. Let's set a compile again. And in line 31 of our search bar.js file is we have another warning, and it's saying that the href attribute is required for an anchor to be keyword accessible. So we have our anchor here. It's basically saying that it's expecting us to type in an href attribute here. Usually I would put a pound, but in this case they're actually asking us for a real link. So I'm just going to put in www.pound.com, and that should clear our error here. So let's reload our page. I'm going to full screen this. And here you can see exactly what we're looking for. So we have our business components here rendered individually, and a business list container, the component is holding each of these business components. So if we actually render more, let's go on into business list. If we actually render a couple more, we would actually be basically rendering the same type of component just numerous times. So you can see the reusability of using React apps. So now we have 8 components being rendered. So this is very easy to change and maintain, and that's what makes React very powerful. So this basically concludes our project, but I want you to take a look at how your project is structured and the way you actually design the components. When it comes to React, actually figuring it out and drawing out your application is very important, because you will be able to see what exactly you're going to be, what kind of components you're going to be building. So that's one of the huge advantages with React. It's very scalable, and large programs that display a lot of changing data are where React performs best. So we're going to be dealing with a lot of state eventually in the future steps of this project. But it's also very useful that it's quite modular. And by modular, I mean that instead of writing large chunks of dense code files, we kind of separate it into very granular pieces of code that makes it very easable to maintain and very reusable. If we want to render more components here, all we need to do is simply go to our business list component and just type them out here. We don't actually have to repeat any kind of code, and it makes it very dry and reusable. So go ahead and mess around. Feel free to look at the CSS and see how it's assigned. I really like the styling they actually put in here, but feel free to mess around with it. Maybe even if you'd like, mess around with more components. Maybe maybe add some more information in the business component, or maybe render it somewhere else or in a different kind of format. Just make sure you come back to this code base, because we're going to be building on top of this for the next pieces of your project. And also here, just in case you were wondering, the mobile aspect of the way it's rendered, here you see it's actually growing into a larger picture. The background image changes for media queries, and the same with the components here in the business. All right, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.